Mara heard them before she saw them. Not the engines, though those came too, low and deliberate, carrying the specific weight of vehicles built for more than ordinary roads. What she heard first was something older than sound. A pressure shift in the air, the way the world tilts very slightly when something significant is about to enter it. She had felt it before, as a child, on certain mornings, when her father would go still at the kitchen table and look toward the door without anyone knocking. She had not felt it in years. She had worked very carefully to make sure she did not. She set down the coffee pot on the warmer. The diner was full for 7 in the morning. Lena Walsh, who owned the place and had run it for 30 years with the competent warmth of a person who genuinely liked people, was calling orders through the kitchen window. Clara Briggs was at her usual corner table with her usual tea, talking about the frost damage to her garden roses with the unhurried specificity of a person for whom the garden was not a hobby, but a serious occupation. A group of 4 road workers filled the window booth, going through eggs and toast with the appetite of men who had been up since 5 and had been outside in cold air since 5:30. 2 teenagers on their way to school sat at the end of the counter, eating fast and not talking, the way teenagers eat when they are not quite awake yet and have places to be. Nobody else noticed anything. Through the long window that ran the full length of the counter, Main Street was doing what it did at that hour. Slow, ordinary, the kind of small-town morning that looked exactly the same from the outside whether you were a person with nothing on your mind or a person who had spent 15 years making sure it looked that way. The bakery 2 doors down was opening its shutters, the owner propping them with the automatic ease of someone who had done it every morning for 20 years. An older man walked a slow brown dog along the far sidewalk. A delivery van idled outside the grocery store while the driver checked something on a clipboard. 2 women spoke briefly on the corner before heading in opposite directions. Then the first black SUV rolled past the window. Then the second. Then the third. They moved at a pace that was not quite slow enough to be obviously deliberate, and not fast enough to be passing through in any normal sense. Tinted windows, clean plates, the particular kind of vehicle that corporate security uses in cities, and that means something entirely different in a town of 300 people, between 2 mountain ridgelines. Mara turned away from the window before the lead vehicle had fully cleared the frame. She picked up the coffee pot. She went to Clara's table and refilled the cup that Clara had not asked to have refilled, because it needed refilling, and because having something to do with her hands was useful. She smiled at the right moment during a sentence about aphids on the climbing roses. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was slow and even and entirely unremarkable, the long-practiced rate of a woman who had nothing interesting happening inside her. She went to the road workers and asked if they needed anything else. She checked the teenagers and brought one of them a glass of water he had not asked for but visibly needed. She wrote something brief and unnecessary in her order pad and tore out the sheet and folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Her hands were steady throughout all of this. Inside, something very old and very precise was doing the kind of total, quiet inventory she had spent 15 years teaching herself not to allow. She had been in Asheville for 23 days. The town sat between 2 ridgelines in the way something sits when the larger landscape around it never quite finished making up its mind about the space. The buildings along Main Street were old and solid, built from timber that had gone gray over decades of weather, and the roads were narrow and cracked in the places where frost pushed through the asphalt each winter, and nobody had gotten around to patching them back exactly right. 312 people, according to the census she had checked from a library computer 3 states away. On the afternoon she decided Asheville would be the next place she went. 1 diner, 1 hardware store, 1 pharmacy, a grocery store, a school, a gas station at the eastern edge of town, 2 roads in and out, the main highway from the north, and the secondary road going east that connected to the interstate after 40 minutes of mountain driving. She knew the roads because she always knew the roads. She knew the 2 diners 2 towns over, and the gas station on the highway that was open 24 hours, and the back roads between here and the interstate, and which of them had cameras and which did not. She knew these things not because she was planning to use them imminently, but because knowing them was the only form of safety she had ever been able to build, and she had learned to build it immediately, in the first few days of each new place, the way other people unpacked boxes and hung pictures on walls. She had arrived on a Tuesday with 1 bag, a car bought for cash 2 states back, and a name that was not hers. Mara Cole. The laminated card in her wallet said. The card was very good, Everything about the constructed version of her life was very good. Her mother had spent years making sure of that, with the thoroughness of a person who understood that the work had to hold against serious scrutiny and could not afford to be merely adequate. Lena had given her the job without asking many questions, which Mara valued more than almost any other quality a person could demonstrate. She poured coffee and took orders and carried plates and smiled and kept her eyes at the right level of engagement, present, warm, interested, the precise quality of a woman who was here and content to be here and had nothing else to be thinking about. She had been doing this long enough that it was not performance anymore. It was simply the register she lived in, the specific pitch of herself that she had practiced until it fit like her own skin. She was very good at it. She had been very good at it for 15 years. The convoy had stopped. She could hear the engines settling, the specific sound of organized, purposeful parking rather than casual stopping. Doors. The measured quality of people getting out of vehicles and assessing a space before they moved through it. She kept her back to the window and took the next order and did not look. She knew what drove those vehicles. She had grown up knowing, had watched her father go still at a table and understood, before she had language for it, that his stillness was not calm, but the thing that calm was built on top of, when a situation required absolutely precise management. Had understood, at 7 years old, that when her father stopped moving that way, she should stop whatever she was doing, and wait, and pay attention, and not make sounds. Her father had been a large, warm, certain man who filled rooms with his presence without meaning to, and made everyone in them feel that whatever was happening was being adequately managed, not because he said so, but because he operated as though this were simply true. He had laughed easily. He had been kind to people without performance. He had a way of moving through the world, through towns, through rooms, through difficult situations, that looked like complete ease, and was, she had come to understand much later, the result of enormous and continuous work. She did not let herself think about him for long. She had learned, over years, that thinking about him for long did not help with the things that needed to be managed right now. A chair scraped near the door. Someone sat down at the table nearest the entrance with the studied casualness of a person performing normalcy, while executing a professional function. Young, from the sound of the movement, shoulders carrying the specific tension of someone who had not yet learned to fully conceal what their body was doing, while their mind was somewhere else. She did not look. She brought him coffee he had not ordered. He looked up with a mildly startled expression, as if he had temporarily forgotten that the humans in the space could see him too. She said, "Let me know if you need anything," and went back to the counter. She had noted, as she was close enough to note, the low-frequency scanner built into his collar. She had noted the secondary one at his wrist, designed to look like a fitness band, which would confirm or complicate whatever the primary returned. She had noted the pattern of his gaze, which was a sweep rather than idle curiosity, returning to the same 4 points in the room on a cycle of approximately 11 seconds. She noted all of this, and let none of it change a single thing about her face, or her hands, or her breathing. At 9, she became aware, without turning toward the window, that the man from the lead vehicle was on the far side of the street. She could not have explained this to anyone who did not already understand it. It was not a sound. It was not something she could point to. It was the same pressure from earlier, now closer and more specifically located. The way you know a fire is near before you can see smoke or feel heat, because the air between you and it has already changed. She was wiping down the counter. She wiped slowly and kept her breathing where it needed to be. Her mother had taught her to manage her heartbeat the way other parents teach children to manage their posture, as a practical skill, practiced until it was automatic, until the reaching for it was unnecessary because it was already operating. A calm heartbeat meant a calm scent profile. A calm scent profile meant that the suppression her mother had built around her at 12 years old held without variation, without the tiny fluctuations at the edges that a trained nose could detect in someone whose composure was controlled rather than genuine. Her composure was genuine. She was calm the way old stone is calm, not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening had been happening for so long that it had become the material itself, rather than a condition imposed on it. He was looking at the northern tree line. She knew this without turning. A person standing on that stretch of sidewalk opposite the diner, reading the tree line, was not thinking about trees. They were assessing sight lines, mapping the relationship between positions and what those positions controlled. understanding the space in the way wolves understand territory, which was not the way humans understood geography at all. She heard him speak, briefly, to the person beside him. The tone of it reached her as texture rather than content, flat, definitive, the tone of someone stating a conclusion rather than discussing one. She moved to the next task. New table, orders, water, plates from the kitchen, carried two at a time the way Lena had shown her in the first week, and which she had been doing ever since, because it was correct and efficient, and the correct, efficient way of doing something was always worth keeping. At 10:15, the man from the lead vehicle was no longer on the far sidewalk. The young man near the door, Owen, she would learn his name from Lena that afternoon, who knew everyone in a 50-mile radius, and their business besides, received a call, stepped outside briefly, came back with the faint and specific ease of someone who has heard what they expected to hear. The scanner at his wrist had not lit. The primary had returned nothing flagged. The secondary had confirmed it. Good. That was the point of 15 years. In the afternoon lull, Lena leaned on the counter beside her with a cup of coffee and said, in the warm and comfortable way of someone sharing neighborhood information, some kind of security company apparently. Bought out the Dalton place for the whole week, paid double, she added. Clara says she counted 8 of them on the North Road this morning. Mara said, busy day for the town. Lena looked at her with the mild, assessing expression of a woman who had watched people sit at her counter for 30 years and developed accurate instincts about the range of things various kinds of mildness were doing on people's faces. She said, you all right? Mara said, perfectly fine. Lena held this for a moment, then she went back to the kitchen, and Mara went back to work, and the afternoon moved through its ordinary remainder without incident. She drove home in the early dark along the cracked road, up the stairs above the hardware store, which smelled of paint thinner and old wood, to the room she had rented with 1 month's cash in advance, and which was small and functional, and had a window that looked down onto Main Street. She stood at the window and looked at the street below. Owen's night replacement stood at the far corner, hands in the pockets of a jacket that was slightly too casual for the temperature, looking upward. Not at the street, at the angles of the buildings, the roof lines and the spaces between them. She noted this with the part of her that noted such things without being asked, and filed it in the larger file she had been building since the convoy passed that morning. A file she had been keeping in the background of the day, without examining it directly, the way you are aware of a sound in another room, without choosing to listen to it. She turned away from the window, and made dinner, and ate it at the small table by the window, and looked at the street below, and thought about Thursday. She would be gone Thursday. The bag was under the bed. It was always under the bed, packed, organized, ready in the specific way that things are ready when their readiness is the result of long, repeated practice rather than a recent decision. Documents, cash in 2 denominations, a change of clothes chosen for utility rather than preference, the practical items of a life that had learned to be portable. She had packed it like this in 11 different rooms. She could do it again in 4 minutes if she had to. She had never had to, because it was always already done. Thursday, she would drive the eastern road to the interstate. She would be 2 states away before anyone noticed the absence. She had done it before. She knew exactly how it went. She lay in the dark above the hardware store and thought about Thursday, and somewhere in the thinking, she stopped thinking about Thursday, and started thinking about the quality of stillness she had seen in the man from the lead vehicle, standing on the far sidewalk reading the northern tree line, and the specific pressure his presence had created in the air, even from that distance, and what it meant that she had felt it, and why she had turned away from the window instead of running. The bag was under the bed. She did not touch it. In the morning she was at the diner before Lena, and had the coffee going before the door was unlocked, and she worked through the morning rush with the same steady pleasantness she always brought, and somewhere in the middle of it she stopped thinking about Thursday altogether, and that was its own kind of information, and she filed it carefully, and did not examine what it meant. He came in 2 days later. Not in the morning, when the diner was busy with the particular noise of a town waking up and Mara was moving between tables with the easy efficiency of someone who had memorized the rhythm of the space within her first week. He came in at 11, when the breakfast crowd had fully cleared, and the lunch crowd had not yet arrived, and the diner had settled into its mid-morning quiet. The low hiss of the coffee machine, Lena's radio through the kitchen door, Two men in the far booth finishing their plates without much conversation, and not in any hurry to leave. The bell above the door rang. Mara was at the far end of the counter, going through the takeout cup stock, checking inventory against the list she kept in her head, because she had found it faster than writing things down. She did not look up immediately. She had learned a long time ago that immediately looking up was what people with nothing on their mind did, and that the practiced beat or two of delay, the signal that she had been doing something and looked when she was ready, was a small and important part of maintaining the surface she kept. She heard him cross the floor. His footsteps had a specific quality she registered without turning. Unhurried, even. The footsteps of a person who moved through spaces with the kind of economy that only came from having been completely certain about yourself for a very long time. She heard the stool pull back from the counter, not the nearest to the door, not the farthest, the one in the middle section that had a clear view of both the entrance and the main window onto Main Street. She noted the choice without noting that she had noted it. She turned around. Up close, he was exactly what she had known he would be, in the way you know something before you see it, when you have grown up in the presence of certain kinds of people, and have developed a sense for what they are, from the way the air moves around them. Dark eyes, that moved with precision, rather than the ordinary restlessness that characterizes the way most people look at rooms. A face that carried no particular expression, which was not the same as a blank face. Blankness was absence, and what she was looking at was not absence but an enormous amount of compressed presence, the specific quality of a person who has organized every visible surface of themselves into stillness and concentrated everything that might otherwise be visible into a center you could not directly see. He was younger than she might have estimated at a distance, or perhaps age simply did not accumulate on him the way it did on people for whom each year was primarily a series of things happening to them. He was looking at the menu card on the counter in front of him, and not actually reading it. She stepped forward. "What can I get you?" He looked up. The directness of the look was not aggressive or challenging. It was the directness of a person who made the decision a long time ago, that softening the way they looked at things cost more in imprecision than it was worth in social comfort. "Coffee," he said. "Black." She poured it. She set it down. She moved a step back. "What's your name?" he asked. Not as a social nicety, not with the warmth of someone trying to make the transaction feel friendlier. He asked it the way someone asks a question that they already have a likely answer to, and want to check the answer against what the room is actually telling them. "Mara," she said. "Cole." He nodded once. The smallest acknowledgement. He looked back at the cup. She turned and went to the far end of the counter, where there was a tray of glasses waiting to be checked and stacked. She kept her movements unhurried, and her attention apparently on the glasses. She could feel his attention on her back. Not as something intrusive. It was not the uncomfortable feeling of being watched in the way that makes you want to step sideways out of the line of sight. It was something more fundamental than that. More like the way you are aware of a significant heat source without looking at it, as a fact in the space, as something the air around her had organized itself in relation to. He was running the catalog, the specific, thorough inventory that a wolf takes of everything in a space when the wolf is responsible for a territory and needs to know what is present and whether any of it presents a problem. Scent, sound, the heartbeat of every person in the room, the microscopic physiological signals that people broadcast without knowing they are broadcasting them, and that a trained nose can read as a complete account of a person's history and current state. She kept her heartbeat at exactly the rate it had been before he walked in. Her mother had taught her this when she was 10, before the ritual, before everything that followed. She had made Mara practice it not when something frightening was happening, but during the ordinary moments of the day, while eating, while reading, while talking, while doing everything that made up the hours of a child's life. Because the skill had to be woven so deeply into the ordinary that reaching for it under pressure was unnecessary. By the time you needed it, it had to already be running. It was running. Slow. Even. The rate of a woman at work on a mid-morning shift, checking glassware, nothing happening, nothing to be aware of. The door opened. She heard the step she recognized from 2 days of listening. Owen, brisk, purposeful, arriving to do something, rather than to be somewhere. He pulled out the stool 2 positions from Calum. She had learned his full name from Lena the previous afternoon, had filed it in the careful mental space where she kept information that mattered, and was not actively thinking about it right now, because actively thinking about it was not something she could afford while the inventory was running, and leaned in and delivered a rapid, low report. She caught the word anomaly. She moved to the next glass on the tray. She heard the pause that followed Owen's report, heard the specific quality of Caleb's response, shorter than Owen's summary, with the particular flatness of a conclusion being administered rather than reached. A decision, not a discussion. Owen straightened. She turned and walked back to the center of the counter. She refilled the coffee cup, 2/3 empty, which was when she always refilled without being asked, because this was her job, and she did her job correctly, and not for any other reason she was prepared to acknowledge right now. He was watching her. The catalog was still running, she could feel it, but the quality of the attention had changed slightly. He had a result, the expected result, or something close enough to it, and he was holding the result up against the room in front of him, checking the consistency of what he was seeing against what the inventory was telling him. She met his eyes for the appropriate duration, politely attentive, professionally brief. She moved away to take the order from 2 people who had come in while she was at the far end. Behind her, she heard him breathe. The slow, deliberate inhalation that was not casual. Not the breath of someone drinking coffee and looking out the window on a mid-morning, the investigative breath, the one that was a second look, reading the room through the air itself, cross-referencing what every other channel of information was reporting against what the oldest channel was finding. She knew this breath. She had watched her father draw it in certain rooms, on certain occasions, when he was reading something in the air that the rest of the room had no vocabulary for. She had watched him draw it, and had paid attention to what he did next, because what he did next was always important. He found nothing. She was calm, and the suppression held when she was calm, and the air said, in all the languages that a wolf's inventory could read, ordinary woman, diner work, mid-morning, nothing of interest. She heard him set the mug down, heard him stand, heard him speak briefly to Owen, a few words, with the quality of a file being closed, and then the bell above the door rang, and the bell was the sound of the situation concluding, and she kept her attention on the table she was serving, and did not watch him leave. Owen stayed for another 40 minutes. He ate the sandwich he ordered without appetite, and checked his phone several times, and did not make eye contact with Mara. He left without anything that would look, to an outside observer, like anything at all. She cleared his table. She brought the dishes to the kitchen. She spoke to Lena about the delivery schedule for the following week, which needed to be adjusted because of the road work on the north side, and Lena talked through the options with the practical efficiency of a woman who managed a small business and was accustomed to small adjustments in logistics. Mara offered 2 suggestions, both reasonable, and Lena took the second one, and that was the conversation. When the last of the early lunch crowd had paid and left, she went to the back room. It was narrow in there. The smell of industrial cleaning solution and old cardboard, a single low stool, a shelf of supplies that had been organized once, and gradually ceased to be organized over the years, until it had the particular disorder of things that were used frequently, and returned approximately, rather than precisely. She leaned with her back against the cool wall and breathed. She had been tested by an alpha king at close range, and found unremarkable. She had managed similar things before, in smaller ways, in other towns, when someone had noticed something slightly inconsistent in her reaction time, or her strength, or the way she handled a situation that an ordinary person would have handled differently. She had managed those moments, all of them, with the practiced ease of long repetition. This was different, not because it was harder. It was not meaningfully harder than some of what she had managed before, but because of what she felt now, in the back room with the cleaning solution smell, and the cool wall, and the specific quality of the aftermath. Not the simple exhaustion of sustained precision, though that was there too. Something underneath that, harder to name. She pressed her palms flat against the wall, and breathed, and looked at the far shelf, and let herself feel the edges of the moment. She thought about the way his eyes had moved when he looked up at her, the specific, contained directness of it. She thought about the half-second pause after she said her name, the internal calibration she had felt rather than seen. Mara Cole, tested against what the room was saying, found consistent. She thought about the fact that he had looked back when he left. She had not been watching. She had been careful not to be watching. But she had known it the way she knew things she was not supposed to know, the older senses filing information into the part of her that received it without announcement, simply kept it, the way the body keeps its own records regardless of what the mind has decided to attend to. He had looked back. She straightened. She arranged her face into the version appropriate for the afternoon. She went back out to the counter. She thought, as she moved through the remaining hours of the shift with her usual precision, I am not leaving on Thursday. Not as a decision made aloud, not as anything she would have been able to defend as a clear choice. More as a recognition of something that had apparently already happened, somewhere below the level of her conscious management, the way you sometimes discover that you have already decided something before you have been through the formal process of deciding it. She picked up the coffee pot and went back to work. Outside the window, Ashevale was doing its early afternoon things. The delivery van had finished at the grocery store and was pulling away. Clara Briggs walked past in the direction of home, carrying her grocery bag with the unhurried ease of a person who has nowhere to be for the rest of the afternoon, and is entirely at peace with this. The two women from the morning corner stop were gone. A child on a bicycle went by too fast for the cracked road. Ordinary town. Ordinary afternoon. Nothing remarkable about any of it. Nothing remarkable about her. She kept her breathing even, her movements efficient, her face pleasant and present, and entirely readable, and she thought about none of the things she was thinking about, and she was very good at it, and the afternoon finished and she drove home, and the bag was under the bed, and she did not touch it. The territorial dispute started on the Monday following Calum Blackthorne's first visit to the diner, and Mara learned its dimensions the same way she learned most things in Ashevale, through the accumulated texture of the town. Lena's radio ran local news all morning, and the local news in that part of the mountains translated pack-adjacent conflict into the kind of language that general audiences could receive without understanding what they were actually receiving. Boundary violations, forest access disputes, reports of wildlife activity in areas where wildlife was emphatically not what was generating the reports. She listened while she worked, and built her picture of the situation in layers, the way she built pictures of everything, carefully, from the outside in, not rushing to conclusions, holding provisional understandings loosely, until more information filled them out. By Wednesday of that week, the situation had put Owen permanently at his table near the door and added 2 more wolves on rotating afternoon shifts. The 3 of them took turns with the kind of visible but unobtrusive positioning that was designed to be a presence rather than an action, to make it clear that the space was claimed and occupied without making anyone who didn't know what to look for feel as though anything unusual was happening. Mara suspected that most of Ashevale's 312 residents interpreted them as exactly what they appeared to be. Security contractors, doing whatever security contractors did, vaguely official and not anyone's business. She brought them all coffee when they came in. She charged for it. She asked no questions. She noted everything. Calum returned on the Wednesday of the first full week of the dispute, and this time his visit carried a different quality. He had established, on his first visit, that the space was safe, and the people in it were what they appeared to be. He was now using it as a working location, one of several, the way a person distributes their presence across multiple points in a territory they are managing. He sat at the counter and spoke with Owen for several minutes, going through something on his phone with the flat, efficient speed of someone working through a checklist they had memorized, but still needed to verify out loud. Then Owen stepped outside to take a call, and Calum sat at the counter alone, with his cup and his phone and the specific quality of stillness she had been learning to read over 2 days of observation, and she brought the coffee over without being asked. The cup was 2/3 empty, which was when she refilled without asking, because anticipating what the room needed before it asked was part of her job, and part of how she made herself forgettable. And he said, without looking up, "Do you know anything about the North Ridge?" She said, "Not much." He said, "It runs 12 miles along the territory border. 60-year dispute. 2 packs have been using it to justify staying armed and organized, which costs them resources they can't afford, and gains them a state of readiness that no longer serves the purpose it originally served." She said, "Why haven't they settled it?" He looked up from his phone. He said, "Because settling it would require each of them to trust the other, and each of them has spent 60 years accumulating evidence that the other is not trustworthy. Some of the evidence was manufactured, and some of it was real, which makes it very difficult to challenge, because the true parts make the false parts look credible." She thought about this. Then she said, "If someone from outside keeps the dispute going, it's harder to see the shape of it clearly from inside." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's exactly it." She refilled his cup and stepped back. He came back Friday. He came back the following Monday. By the third week, a pattern had established itself that she could have set her watch by if she had been inclined to be that precise about it. Mid-morning, the check-in with Owen, or whoever was on shift, and then the stool at the counter, and the coffee and conversations that had begun to extend past the territorial situation and its management into something harder to categorize. He talked about decisions, about the specific weight of choices that could not be undone once made, the way they stayed present in the body like old injuries that had healed but not entirely, that made themselves known in cold weather or under pressure. He talked about the difference between authority that was freely given and authority that was earned, and the different kinds of ongoing work each required. He talked about the loneliness of a position where the people around you managed the dynamic primarily by deferring to you, which meant the things you were most uncertain about were least likely to be challenged by anyone with the standing and independence to challenge them usefully. He was not complaining. She understood this with certainty. Calum Blackthorne was not a man who complained, who would have recognized the activity as something available to him. He was thinking aloud, using her as an external processing space in the way that people used someone who was outside the situation and therefore had no stake in the outcome. She was a human woman, as far as he knew. She had no position in his world, no interest in the political arrangement of territories and pacts, no advantage to gain from any particular version of the outcome. She was simply there, and she listened without an agenda. She was a very useful listener. She had been practicing for 15 years. She noticed the things he said about the weight of decisions. She noticed what he said about the loneliness at the center of certain kinds of authority. She found, in the evenings after her shift, that she was still thinking about these things, in the way you think about something that is connected with something already present in your own mind, not because it resembles your experience exactly, but because it touches the shape of it from an angle you hadn't expected. She thought about her father, who had described his own weight in the same language, not metaphorically but concretely, as something that occupied actual physical space in him, that had mass and had to be carried. A different kind of weight. The weight of choosing freedom over the belonging that most of his kind organized themselves around, and understanding fully what that choice cost, and choosing it anyway, every day, for as long as he had. She kept these thoughts at the edge of her thinking. She did not bring them closer. One evening near closing, with the diner empty except for the two of them, and the sounds of Lena closing up in the kitchen, he said, "There's going to be a meeting next week. Both packs, neutral location, full delegations." She said, "Is that rare?" He said, "Getting both of them in the same room voluntarily hasn't happened in 11 years. The last time it happened, someone came armed, and the meeting ended before it began." She said, "What's different this time?" He said, "I gave each side something they needed, and something they were afraid of, in that order." She turned to look at him. He was holding his cup in both hands and looking at the window, at the dark main street outside. His expression was the same as it always was, contained, precise, giving nothing away that he had not chosen to give, except that there was something slightly different in it tonight, a quality she had not seen before, and was still finding the words for. Not tiredness, exactly, the particular weight of a person who has made the right choice and understands exactly what the right choice is going to cost. She said, "Fear first." He said, "Cooperation that comes from wanting something is fragile. It doesn't hold when conditions change, or when one side starts wondering if they could get more by acting differently. When the cooperation also includes a full understanding of what the alternative is, that holds. Not because people are afraid, but because they have a complete picture." She thought about this for a long time after she drove home that night. She stood at the window of the room above the hardware store and looked at the dark street below, and thought about complete pictures and partial ones, about the specific fragility of arrangements built on only half the information. She thought about her own life, which had been built almost entirely on one half of its information, the half that was about staying safe, staying invisible, moving before anything could become serious enough to need managing. The other half, the part of her that her mother had wrapped in silence at 12 years old and sent her into the world without, had been absent from every arrangement she had made with every town and every person and every version of herself she had lived inside. She thought, "I have never had a complete picture of my own life." She turned away from the window before the thought could become anything larger. Owen's night replacement was at the corner, looking up. The roof lines again. Always the roof lines. She noted this. She was developing a file of notes about the roofline watching, and the file was beginning to have a shape. The shape suggested something she was not looking at directly. She continued not looking at it directly, and went to bed. In the morning she came into the diner early, and the light was pale gold through the east-facing windows, and Lena was already in the kitchen starting the prep, and the radio was on, and everything was exactly what it was. A small diner in a small town, between two mountain ridgelines. And she was the woman who worked the counter, and nothing about any of it was remarkable. She said good morning to Lena. She started the coffee. She arranged the counter the way she always arranged it, in the specific order she had established in her first week and had maintained since. And she thought about the meeting Caleb was preparing for, and what it would mean if it worked, and whether it would work. She found, somewhat against her expectations, that she genuinely hoped it would. She stood at the counter in the early morning light, and held this thought for a moment, examining it, turning it over. Genuine hope for an outcome she had no stake in. She could not remember the last time she had felt that. She could not remember, specifically, the last time she had allowed herself to care about an outcome that did not directly affect her own safety or continued invisibility. She set the thought down carefully. She went to start setting up the tables for the morning rush. She said good morning to Owen when he came in at 7, which was earlier than usual and which she noted, and he said good morning back, which he did not usually do, and they both continued without making anything of it. And outside, the mountains did what mountains do when they are very old and largely indifferent to the complicated things that happen at their feet. They were there, and they stayed there, and the dispute ran along their ridgelines like it had for 60 years, and in the diner on Main Street in Asheville, something quieter and less definable than a dispute was also running, and also had been running for weeks, and was also approaching something that would eventually require resolution. She did not dream often. When she did, it was usually the same one, not dramatic, not the kind of dream that announces its own significance with the sweeping production values that the mind sometimes applies to things it wants you to pay attention to. Just her mother's kitchen, rendered with the specific fidelity of genuine memory, the herb bundles hanging from the ceiling beams, drying slowly through the autumn in the way they always had, filling the room with a smell that was partly ordinary cooking herbs and partly something older and less nameable. The sound of water running somewhere just out of sight. The quality of the light in late afternoon, which came through the kitchen window at an angle that made the dust in the air visible and turned it briefly golden. She had this dream on the 4th night after Caleb Blackthorne began coming to the diner regularly. She woke before 5, in the dark of the room above the hardware store, and lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the specific silence of Asheville in the deep part of night. No traffic, no voices. The occasional creak of old timber adjusting to the temperature, the low sound of wind moving through the cedar trees at the edge of town. She lay in this silence and thought about her mother, and she let herself think about it without the usual careful rationing, because it was before 5 in the morning, and there was no one to see what it cost her. Vera Voss had been the kind of woman who was never fully at rest. Not anxious. Vera did not do anxiety, had no patience for it, considered it an expensive and imprecise way of spending attention that could be used more usefully. Alert, rather, perpetually and specifically alert, in the way of a person for whom vigilance was not a response to particular danger, but the fundamental mode of existing in a world she understood, from direct experience, to be complicated and not reliably kind. She had been beautiful in the unremarkable way that certain women are beautiful, not in the way that makes people look twice in the street, but in the way that becomes more apparent the longer you are near them. That has to do with the precision and economy of expression, the way the face reflects what is happening inside it, without drama or delay. She had been fierce in a way she never made unremarkable, a way she wore openly and without apology. She had loved Mara, with the particular, serious love of a person who understood that love was profoundly insufficient protection, and who intended to supply everything else as well. Mara's father had been the other kind. Glenn Voss moved through rooms the way weather moved through valleys. You felt him before you saw him, and the space changed when he was in it. And when he was gone, there was a specific quality of absence that was different from the ordinary absence of someone simply not being present. He was large in his physical presence, and larger in his nature, the kind of person who took up exactly as much space as they actually occupied. which sounds simple until you realize how rarely anyone does it. He had been a rogue alpha. In the world Mara had been born into, this was not a neutral description. It carried meaning that its two plain English words did not fully convey to someone without the context to receive them. An alpha, without a territory, was already unusual. An alpha who actively chose not to acquire one, who had the capability and the standing, and declined to use it, was a different kind of unusual. The kind that made the people who had organized their lives around the assumption that everyone eventually chose territory and authority and belonging, sit with a discomfort they did not always understand the source of. Glenn Voss had never wanted a territory, had never wanted to be responsible for a pack's politics, a pack's safety, the specific and unending negotiation of authority and loyalty that running a territory required. He wanted to live in the spaces between things, between the human world and the wolf one, between the organized territories and the wild country beyond their borders, between the person he was in daylight and the one he was at night. He wanted to be responsible for his family and for himself, and he wanted to be free, and he wanted these things with the complete and unapologetic certainty of a person who had looked clearly at what the alternative offered and found it genuinely insufficient. This was, to certain people, a profound problem. Not because he had done anything harmful, not because of any action he had taken or any conflict he had initiated, but because his existence was an argument. He proved, by simply being alive and free and without any visible suffering for the lack of submission that most of his kind organized themselves around, that the choice was a choice, that it was possible to be what they were and to live as he lived. And for packs that had built their entire systems of governance, their entire cultures and social arrangements, on the premise that the choice was not really available, that independence was not viable, that belonging to something larger was not a preference but a necessity. A man who chose differently was a problem that would eventually need to be resolved. He had known this. Vera had known it too, with the particular knowledge of someone who had lived beside that fact for years, and had spent those years preparing for a day she prayed would not come, and could not afford to believe would not. Mara was 12 when the preparation became necessary. She remembered the days before, with a specificity that years had not softened, that she visited rarely, precisely because the specificity did not soften with time. The week before, Vera becoming more precise in everything, her movements more economical, her conversations shorter and more pointed. The day before, a quiet that was different from ordinary quiet, that had a texture to it, a specific weight. The night before, Vera in the kitchen at 10 in the evening, the herb bundles taken down from their hooks and arranged on the table in a pattern that Mara understood, without having been taught, was not cooking. The smell that began to rise from the arrangement was something she had no name for. It lifted the fine hairs on her arms before she was close enough to see the pattern clearly. Vera had explained it kneeling in front of her, eye level, with the directness that was her particular form of tenderness. The people who are coming for your father will not stop once they have found him. They will also look for anyone who carries what he carries. This will make it harder for them to look. Not impossible, but harder. And harder is what we have. Mara had asked, "What does it do?" Vera had said, "You are a wolf's daughter. Your blood knows what you are. This will teach the outside of you to forget what the inside knows. You will smell human. You will seem human. Your heartbeat will read human to anyone who checks it. As long as you stay calm. As long as you do not panic or use what is in you. The reading will hold." She had asked, "What if I can't stay calm?" Vera had said, "You will learn. I am going to teach you right now, tonight, and you are going to keep practicing it for the rest of your life, until it is more natural than breathing, until you can do it in your sleep, because you will need to." The ritual had hurt. It had hurt the way she imagined it would feel to have a layer of the world, a layer of yourself, wrapped in something that muffled it, not removed. Vera had been very clear about this, not removed. Nothing removes it. It is there, and will always be there, just made unavailable to the outside. Like being shown a room full of color, and then being fitted with lenses that rendered everything in a single flat gray. The color was still there. The room was still there. She just could not reach it. She had been on a bus by morning. Vera had given her 3 envelopes. Documents, very good ones, as she would come to understand more fully over the years. Documents that held against significant scrutiny, built by someone who understood how people checked such things, and had made sure the checks would find what they were supposed to find. cash, in the denominations useful for a 12-year-old making her way in a world that did not know she was 12. And a letter, which Vera said she should not open until she was somewhere safe and on her own. She had opened it in a bus station in a city 300 miles away. She had found a corner of the waiting area and sat with her back to the wall and her bag on her lap and read it in the particular light of a bus station at 7 in the morning, which is a specific and lonely kind of light. The letter said, "You are Mara Voss, no matter what name you carry. You are Glenn's daughter as much as mine. Being hidden is not the same as being erased. Stay safe, stay calm. Find your way back to yourself when it is time." She had read it several times. Then she had put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the bag, and she had stepped out of the bus station into the city, and she had not spoken her real name aloud in 15 years. Now she lay in the room above the hardware store and looked at the ceiling and let herself think about all of it without rationing. The kitchen, the smell of herbs and something older, the weight of what the ritual had cost, which was not gone simply because she did not think about it frequently. The bus, the city, the first room, the second, the third, the long accumulated progression of places and names and careful, constructed lives, each one slightly different in its specifics and identical in its essential quality. A life that was about continuing, about being safe, about not being found. She had not, in 15 years, built anything that was about more than that. She thought about Calum, who moved through his life with the bedrock certainty of a person who had never had a reason to doubt that he was what he was, and that being what he was acceptable, who spoke plainly about difficult things, who sat at a diner counter and thought aloud about the weight of decisions, who seemed to find it entirely natural to be fully present in the space he occupied, who looked back when he left rooms. She thought about what it would feel like to be that. She set the thought down carefully and turned onto her side and looked at the window, through which the pre-dawn gray of the sky was just beginning to be distinguishable from the dark. Her packed bag was under the bed. She had not checked it in 11 days. She had not checked it, had not gone to the edge of the bed and crouched down and verified that it was there and organized and ready. For 11 days. This was the longest she had gone without checking it in approximately 2 years. She looked at the ceiling for a while longer. Then she got up and made coffee, and stood at the window with the cup warming her hands, and watched the early light come into Main Street, slow and pale and unremarkable, the way morning came into mountain towns in winter, as if the light itself was aware that it had a long way to go before it would be warm. She drank her coffee. She went to get ready for her shift. She did not check the bag. Dren did not like her. She had understood this from the first afternoon he came through the diner, following close behind Calum, moving with the particular focused efficiency of someone whose professional orientation toward everything in his alpha's perimeter was fundamentally interrogative. Not hostile, exactly. Hostility would have been a specific thing, with a specific texture, and what she was reading in him was not that. It was the deep, structural skepticism of a person whose job was to have accounted for everything in a space, and who recognized, on some level that he could not yet make specific, that he had not fully accounted for her, not what she was. He could not have named what bothered him, and she knew this. Just that the picture of her did not quite resolve into the clean shape of ordinary when you looked at it from exactly the right angle, and Dren looked at everything from exactly the right angle. She respected this without warmth. The documents arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and she knew they were coming before she saw them. Not from any particular information. She had not overheard anything specific, had not noticed any specific change in Dren's behavior that would telegraph it. She knew in the way she knew things, that her mother had wrapped in silence but not removed, a kind of peripheral awareness that did not announce itself and did not need to. She was covering the counter alone. Lena had gone to the back to work through the weekly inventory order, which she did every Thursday afternoon, which meant that Mara had the front of the diner to herself for approximately 2 hours. She was refilling the napkin dispensers at the far end of the counter when Dren came through the door. He did not sit down. He crossed directly to the table, where Calum was working through something on his phone, and placed a thin folder on the table and leaned in. And the report he delivered was rapid and low and precise, in the way that Dren was precise about everything. No wasted words, no context that had not been requested. Everything organized in the order of significance. Mara was 20 feet away. The napkin dispensers required a specific technique. Fold, tuck, press, next. She continued with this technique. She heard the birth record that held against 3 standard verification methods and failed the 4th, which was the one that cross-referenced against hospital records in the county of supposed birth, and there were no records in the county of her supposed birth that corresponded to the date and name on the document. She heard the social security number that had been issued with the specific cleanliness of something constructed, rather than accumulated, over years of actual use. She heard the 8 years of residence history covered by addresses that were real and verifiable, but that bore no third-party confirmation, no lease agreements with her name, no utility records, no bank accounts, no school enrollment, no nothing except the address itself, which existed, and a name connected to it, which appeared in no other record from those years. She heard no photographs from any period before her 18th year. Fold, tuck, press, next. She heard the pause that followed the end of the report. She heard the specific quality of Calum's response, shorter than the summary, with the tone of a conclusion rather than a discussion, not a question, not an instruction to investigate further, a conclusion, administered, flat, final. She heard Dren's response, I understand that. But, another sentence from Calum. The shape of it was the specific shape of a door being closed. Dren straightened. He picked up the folder. He turned to leave. His gaze crossed the room and found her at the napkin dispensers. She held his gaze from 20 feet away, with the pleasant, unhurried expression of a woman who had been working on a napkin dispenser for several minutes and was now looking at the person leaving, because that is what people do when someone leaves a room, and you happen to be facing the direction they are going. Dren held her gaze for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds more than casual, and then he left. She went back to the napkins. Calum stayed for another 30 minutes and talked about the ceasefire meeting that had happened that morning, the one he had spent weeks engineering, both packs, neutral location, first voluntary meeting in 11 years, and they had agreed to a provisional structure, not the full shared governance arrangement he had been working toward, not yet, but a formal cessation with a monitoring element, and this was more than had existed before, and was, by any reasonable measure, a meaningful result. He talked about it with the specific quality of someone reporting a successful outcome who is fully aware that successful outcomes are not endings. His manner was not triumphant. It was the manner of someone who has moved one piece to a position it needed to be in and is already thinking about the next pieces. She listened. She said appropriate things. She was calm and pleasant and entirely ordinary. When he left, she went to the back room and sat on the low stool and thought with the kind of clean, cold clarity she could access when she needed it. The calculation was familiar. She had run it 11 times before, in 11 different towns, and the shape of it was always similar. Someone finding the gaps in the background, the gaps being unfixable, the investigation deepening over time regardless of what she did to manage the surface. She had always known when to leave. It was the one skill she could claim with complete confidence. She had always known when to leave, and she had always left in time. She should leave now. The perimeter was a complication. With wolves posted at the eastern road and the gas station and conducting vehicle patrols on the main highway, a clean departure before dawn would require timing and patience, and probably a route she hadn't fully mapped yet. Not impossible. Not even particularly difficult, given enough attention and the right window. She knew how to find those windows. She had been finding them for 15 years. She should leave now. She should begin planning the departure today, while she still had several days to identify the right window, and she should be gone before Dren's investigation reached the point where it pulled Calum's attention firmly in her direction, despite his apparent dismissal of it this afternoon. She sat with this for several minutes. Then she went back out to the counter because the lunch crowd had started coming in, and the counter needed to be covered. The pack war escalated over the following week, with a speed that reordered everything. 3 incidents on the northern border in 5 days, 2 involving the direct destruction of monitoring equipment that both packs had agreed to maintain as part of the ceasefire structure, and 1 involving a confrontation between a patrol from one side and a group from the other that resulted in injuries, and was, by any standard definition, a violation of the provisional agreement. 2 of Calum's scouts went missing on a Wednesday. They were found on Thursday, alive but in condition consistent with a coordinated ambush. Not a confrontation stumbled into, but a prepared interception of people who had been in a location that should not have been knowable to whoever had intercepted them. The leaked patrol route was the specific piece of information that Mara found most significant. A leaked route meant a source. A source meant that something that had appeared to be an external situation was at least partly an internal one, that someone inside the arrangement, someone with access to operational details, was providing those details to people who were using them to damage the arrangement from the inside. Owen disappeared from his post at the diner on a Wednesday afternoon for 6 hours. He came back with the specific quality of someone who has received information they are managing. The jaw slightly set, the awareness slightly expanded, the practiced containment of someone who had been trained to do their job, regardless of what the information was. And Calem's security positioning shifted. She had been watching the shift develop for days, the way you watch a picture come gradually into focus when you are not quite sure yet what it will be. The pair that rotated through the streets on foot had begun spending their time increasingly near the eastern buildings, which meant they were repositioning their primary attention from the street-level perimeter to the building line. The vehicle patrol had adjusted its timing in ways that shortened its coverage window on the northern approach. And on 3 consecutive nights, a person she had not seen before, tall, with the kind of build that comes from specific training applied to a specific purpose, appeared on the rooftop, directly opposite the diner. Not walking, not scanning, positioned, learning the geometry of a particular space from a particular angle, in the specific way that a person learns geometry they intend to use. She understood what this meant. A perimeter guard watches outward. A rooftop observer, positioned and still and learning angles, is not watching outward. They are watching inward. They are accounting for a threat that is already inside the space they are assessing. A threat that will come from a fixed elevated position at a specific angle, and they are determining what that angle is and what it controls. Someone was going to shoot Calem. Not a spontaneous act. A planned one, prepared carefully, with advanced positioning and intelligence about his movements. The kind of operation that required time and resources, and the willingness to sacrifice 3 operational assets to accomplish the objective. She came home that Friday evening and stood at the window above the hardware store and looked at the street below. She looked at the building opposite, at the roofline she had been watching for 3 nights, and she thought about what it meant to know something and not act on it. She had spent 15 years knowing things and not acting on them. It was a fundamental part of how she had built her survival. You noticed, and you filed, and you let it be someone else's problem, because making it your problem was the thing that got you found. She went to her bed and looked at the bag underneath it. She should leave. She was thinking about it too much. The thinking itself was the problem. She had spent 15 years learning not to think too hard about the situations she moved through, not to let them matter enough to generate this kind of sustained consideration, because mattering was the thing that made leaving difficult, and leaving was the thing that kept her alive. She reached under the bed and put her hand on the bag and held it for a moment, and then she let go and pulled her hand back and lay down on top of the covers and looked at the ceiling. She thought about her mother's letter, "Find your way back to yourself when it is time." She thought about a shadow on a rooftop learning the angles of a space. She lay in the dark for a long time. She did not pack the bag. In the morning she went to work, and Calem came in at 10 and sat at the counter and told her about the plan he was developing for addressing the leak in the arrangement. Careful, methodical, not the kind of plan that announced itself. And she listened and refilled his coffee and said the right things. And when he left, she cleared his cup and watched through the window as he walked back down Main Street, with Owen beside him and 2 others behind. And she thought, all right. All right then. Whatever was going to happen, she was going to be here for it. She was not examining this decision too closely. She was simply noting that it was made, in the way you note things that happen below the level of conscious management and arrive fully formed, and she was going to live inside it and see where it led. She picked up the coffee pot. She went back to work. She did not leave on Friday. Saturday came without ceremony, the way days came in mountain towns in winter, pale and cold and without any particular insistence on its own significance. She drove to the diner in the gray early light and worked the morning shift with the same steady efficiency she always brought. And Calem did not come in, and Owen sat at his table, with the specific energy of someone running on shorter sleep than they needed, and managing the shortfall through discipline rather than rest. And the diner was busy, and then quiet, and then busy again, as the day moved through its phases. She worked through all of it. She carried plates and poured coffee, and took orders and wiped the counter, and said the right things at the right times. And the practiced pleasantness of it was not performance anymore, had not been performance for a long time. It was simply who she was when she was working, the version of herself that fit this space and did its job well, and was not thinking about anything larger than what the room required. Except that she was. She was thinking about the rooftop observer, and the changed security positioning, and the leaked patrol route, and the specific geometry of what those three things meant in combination. She was thinking about these things in the background of every other thing she was doing, the way you think about a problem that has not been solved and will not stop being unsolved simply because you are currently doing something else. In the afternoon, between the lunch and dinner shifts, she went to the back room and closed the door and stood very still with her eyes closed. She reached inward. This required a kind of deliberate, directed attention that she had not applied to this particular direction in years. Not since the early period after the bus, when she had still been learning to live with the suppression, and had occasionally tested its edges the way you test a sealed room, pressing gently, verifying that the seal held, withdrawing without trying to open anything. She had stopped doing this after the first few years, stopped reaching for that part of herself, stopped verifying the presence of it, because the verification was a form of acknowledgement, and acknowledgement had felt like a kind of grief she could not afford to carry. But she reached for it now. Inward, through the layers of the ordinary self she had built, through the pleasantness and the efficiency, and the careful heartbeat management, and the 15 years of practice, past the ritual's outer surface, to the place where the suppression sat like a sealed room in a house she had been living in every day, without opening that particular door. The room was still there. What was inside the room was still there. She had expected, on some level, that years of disuse would have changed it, diminished it, or altered its character, or rendered it less than it had been. Instead, it felt the way things feel when you return to them after a long absence, and find that time, which changes everything around them, has left the thing itself essentially what it was, older, perhaps, quieter, more settled in itself, but present, and recognizable, and fundamentally unchanged in the ways that mattered. It felt like coming back to something that had been waiting. She did not try to access it. She did not push against the suppression's edges, or attempt to do anything with what she had found. She simply acknowledged it, noted its continued presence, said something to it in the language below language that existed in that place, not words, but the older form of communication that preceded words, that the body used when the mind's vocabulary was insufficient. I know you are here. I have always known. I am sorry I have not said so in a very long time. She came back up through the layers, and opened her eyes, and the back room was the back room. Cardboard boxes, and cleaning solution, and the low stool, and the shelf of supplies in its gradual disorder. She stood there for a moment, simply standing, and then she went back out to the counter. That evening she stood at her window above the hardware store, and looked at the building opposite. The rooftop was empty in the fading late afternoon light. She had expected this. The observer came at night, when daylight could not reveal the position, when the learning of angles could be done in the dark, that also concealed the purpose of the learning. She thought about what she had found inward. She thought about the fact that it was still there, that 15 years had not erased what her mother had worked so hard to conceal without destroying. She thought about the letter. Being hidden is not the same as being erased. She had read those words at 7 in the morning in a bus station, and had understood them as instruction, as comfort, as the best thing her mother could give her under the circumstances. She understood them differently now, not as instruction or comfort, but as statement of fact, as accurate description of what had been done and what it meant. Hiding was not erasure. The thing that was hidden was still itself. She thought about what it would mean to stop hiding, not to anyone else, not in terms of what anyone else might find or know or respond to, but to herself, what it would mean, internally, to make a different kind of choice. She had been making the same choice for 15 years. The choice was called survival, and it had served its purpose, and she was alive and intact and safe in a room above a hardware store, in a town in the mountains, and the choice had done what it was supposed to do. She wondered if it had also cost her something that she had never fully named, because naming it would have required acknowledging that there had been a price. The thought sat with her while she made dinner. It sat with her while she ate. It sat with her when she washed up and turned off the kitchen light and went to the window again, because the window was where she went when things were sitting with her, and it looked out at the street below, which was quiet and dark now. The businesses closed, the street empty except for the figure at the corner. Caleb's night replacement, at the corner, looking up at the buildings, at the roof lines. She watched him for a moment. She watched the angles he was looking at, the building opposite the diner, the one next to it, the gap between them that created a clear sight line down to the stretch of Main Street where Caleb spent most of his time when he was in the open. She understood the geometry with precision that had nothing to do with any training she had received or any information she had been given. She understood it, the way she understood things that her mother had wrapped in silence but not removed. The older knowledge, the kind that did not need to be taught because it was simply present in what she was, available when she was ready to use it. The shot would come from the building opposite. Between the second and third floors, the window with the clearest angle, which was the one the observer had been positioning themselves closest to on the last 2 nights. It would come in the window between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the street was at its emptiest, and the coverage in the rotation had its briefest gap. It would be silver. It was always silver. She was standing at her window thinking about all of this with the clean, detached precision of someone solving a problem, and then she noticed that she was thinking about it that way, not as something terrible happening to someone she could not help, not as something she needed to escape, but as a problem she was working out how to solve, and she sat with that recognition for a long time. Her mother had told her, protection is not the same as living. One day you will have to choose which one you want more. She had spent 15 years interpreting this as meaning that she would, one day, be able to live openly instead of protectively, to be herself instead of the constructed version. She had understood it as a future promise, a thing she was moving toward through the necessity of survival. She understood it differently now. The choice was not between 2 different futures. The choice was available right now, in this room, at this window, looking at the angles of buildings in a dark street in a small town. The choice was available in this moment the same way it was available in every moment. It was just that in this moment she was looking at it clearly enough to see it. She let herself look at it. She went to bed. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling, and let herself fully feel the weight of the decision she was making. And the decision was not about leaving, and not about staying, and not about safety, and not about risk. It was about the thing that her mother had been trying to tell her from the beginning, the thing that she had been able to protect and had not been able to access, the thing that had been sitting in a sealed room, in a house she lived in every day. Some decisions are made below the level of language. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep, exactly, but she was more at rest than she had been in weeks, and the rest had a different quality from the vigilant non-sleep she had been practicing for years. It had the quality of resolution, of a person who has made a choice, and is now simply in the period between making the choice and doing what the choice requires. At 2 in the morning she got up and made tea, and stood at the window with the cup in both hands, and looked at the building opposite. Something moved on the rooftop, a shadow, briefly, shifting from one position to another with the slow deliberateness of something that did not expect to be seen. There and then still, back to the patient learning of angles. Mara set down the cup. She went to the closet and put on her shoes and jacket. She did not look at the bag under the bed. She went down the stairs and into the cold night air and began, very quietly, and with absolute clarity of purpose, to move. The first sign was not a sound. It was the specific quality of absence that arrives in the fraction of a second after something has already happened. The negative space of 2 security personnel who had been stationed below her window every night for the past 6 nights, running their check-ins with the regularity of a schedule, whose voices she had been tracking without consciously deciding to track them, and who were no longer there. The absence was a sound all its own. Mara was on her feet before the second had passed. She did not turn the light on. She did not need to. She dressed in the dark with the efficiency of someone who has practiced the action often enough to have made it automatic, and she was out the door and at the bottom of the stairs before the rational part of her brain had fully assembled an explanation for why she was moving. The hardware store's side door opened without noise. She had learned its exact angle of resistance in the first week, the way she learned all such things. not with any particular future purpose in mind, but because knowing them was the first thing she did in any space she inhabited, the baseline from which everything else was built. She stepped into the alley between the hardware store and the building beside it, and stood still and listened. 3 in the morning in Asheville had its own specific quality, nearly total silence, broken only by the wind moving down from the northern ridgelines in slow, cold gusts, and the distant sound of the perimeter vehicle's engine, which was running, but was farther away than the rotation schedule would have put it. The rotation was 4 minutes behind. 4 minutes behind meant the rotation had been disrupted. She moved down the alley toward the back of the diner, keeping close to the wall on her left, moving at a pace that covered ground without generating sound. The alley was narrow and dark except where the light from a single working street lamp at the far end reached just far enough to make the shadows visible. She stayed in the shadows. The diner's service area opened at the end of the alley, a wider space, concrete, used in daylight for deliveries, and at night for nothing in particular. 2 large waste containers, a delivery loading zone marked with fading painted lines, a chain-link fence along the far side, and above the diner's back door, a single orange overhead light that illuminated the space with the specific flat quality of industrial lighting, making everything in it look both brighter and more exposed than it would have under natural light. 3 men. She took this in from the edge of the alley before she moved further. 3 men. Tactical clothing. The kind of equipment that spoke not of improvisation, but of preparation. Of a plan that had been made and resourced and rehearsed before this moment. They were positioned with the coordinated economy of people who had worked together before. 2 near the fence, 1 in motion, moving with quiet confidence toward the center of the space. She saw Calum. He had shifted. She understood this immediately, and without needing to examine the understanding. The way you understand things you have known since before you had words for them. In the flat orange light, the dark form was very large, and very capable, and deeply familiar to the part of her that her mother had sealed away at 12 years old, and that had been listening from behind that seal for 15 years. He was moving with the controlled power of an alpha managing an ambush, outnumbered, working with the terrain, buying time. The silver round had already found his shoulder. She could see it in the way he was holding himself, the specific compensatory quality of a person whose system is being actively disrupted. Silver worked fast. She had heard this described, but had never seen it directly. She was seeing it now. The wolf's healing ability, the thing that made this kind of confrontation otherwise uneven, was being suppressed. He went to one knee. One of the 2 men near the fence was raising his weapon. The angle was direct. The distance was short. At that distance, with silver rounds and a wounded target, the second shot would be definitive. She was already moving. There was nothing between her and the service area. The mouth of the alley was 3 steps behind her, and the first man was 7 steps ahead, and she covered those 7 steps in the time that a person moving with ordinary human speed would have covered 4 of them, which was a fact about what she was, that the exertion was beginning to make available, regardless of what the suppression had built around it. She came in on his weapon hand with both of hers. Not a frontal grab. That was too slow, and too dependent on the element of surprise holding past the first contact, which it often did not. She came in from a lateral angle, redirecting the barrel before he had registered her arrival, using the geometry of his own grip against him. The hand that holds a weapon braces in specific ways, and those braces can be used as lever points if you know where to apply pressure and in which direction. She had learned this at 9 years old, from her father, in what she had then thought was a game, and had understood much later was preparation. The shot discharged into the chain-link fence with a sound like a bell being struck, sharp and resonant in the cold air, and she was already continuing the motion, not stopping at the redirect but following it through, using his momentum, which was forward and now off balance, extending it into the direction physics had already committed to. The fence caught him. The second man was moving before she completed the turn. He was faster than the first and more experienced, and he was already adjusting for the fact that she was not where she should have been. Not frozen, not fleeing, but present, and moving in a direction he had not anticipated. He led with his weapon hand raised, and he had his own momentum, and he thought it would be decisive. She closed the distance, in less time than he had allocated for her to cross it. The wall was 3 steps to his left, close enough to be useful. She used him as the instrument of her approach, and the wall as the terminal point, and the result was a contact with the wall that ended his participation in the next several minutes. He went down, The weapon went one direction, he went another. The third man. He was near Calum, positioned with his weapon at a specific angle. She read the angle in the fraction of a second available to her, and she understood what it was aimed at, and she moved between them. The shot fired. She felt it catch the outer edge of her left arm, and the sensation was not like anything she had a prior reference for. Not pain, not exactly. Not immediately. The deep, specific, cellular wrongness of silver entering tissue that was not fully human. The protest of a biology that recognized the substance and knew what it was made to do to things like her. Like a burn that went deeper than burns ordinarily went, that found something below the surface and targeted it specifically. She did not go down. She took the weapon from the third man with the direct efficiency her father had always said was more effective than force for its own sake. Find the structure, use the structure, let physics do the work. He went down. She stood over him for a moment to verify that he would stay down, and he would stay down. The service area was quiet. She was standing in the flat orange light of the overhead fixture in her jacket, with blood beginning to run from the outside of her left arm, and the cold air was very present on her face, and the three men were on the ground at 3 different positions in the space, and Calum was on the ground 3 feet in front of her, on one knee, with a shoulder wound that was fighting him, looking up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face. She had seen him contain very large things behind very small changes in his expression. She had seen him manage difficult information, and difficult situations, and difficult people, with the same quality of compressed, controlled presence. She had never seen his expression do what it was doing right now, which was the specific and total movement of a person encountering something that does not fit any category they have previously constructed. She met his eyes. And then she became very precisely aware of what her arm was doing. The wound on the outer edge of her left arm, which had been bleeding as a human wound would bleed, was doing something that human wounds did not do. The edges of the wound, where the silver had made contact with the tissue, were darkening in the specific way she had heard described but never seen. The ashy, particular darkening of wolf-adjacent blood responding to silver. The cellular signature that distinguished this kind of injury from an ordinary one, in the way that a fingerprint distinguishes one person from another. And the edges were beginning, slowly and with the laboring quality of a mechanism working against a significant constraint, to close. Not quickly, not cleanly, not the efficient, rapid healing of a wolf operating at full capacity. The kind that made silver dangerous rather than merely painful. Just movement, slow, unmistakable, impossible movement. The biology of what she was asserting itself through the 15-year suppression, because the exertion had fractured something in its outer surface, and the fracture was letting through what had always been there. She stood in the orange light and looked at her arm, and felt the cold air on her face, and looked at Calum, who was looking at her arm, and she did not say anything. Because there was nothing to say that would be sufficient, and she had always known, somewhere in the place where the sealed room lived, that if this moment came, she would not be able to say anything sufficient. So she stood, and let him see what he was seeing, and did not try to manage it. It was the most honest she had been in 15 years, and the cold was very present, and the orange light was very flat, and somewhere in the distance the perimeter vehicle was changing course, coming back toward the sound of the shot and the chain-link fence. And in approximately 45 seconds, Dren would come around the corner of the diner with the others, and everything would change in the specific, irreversible way that things change when the thing you have been hiding has been seen. She did not look away from Calum. He did not look away from her arm. The next 40 seconds passed in the specific silence of something already decided. Dren arrived 47 seconds after the shot in the chain-link fence. He came around the corner of the diner with Ray and 4 others, moving with the organized speed of a group that had been alerted and was responding in the specific way of people who had trained for this, fanning out as they entered the space, establishing positions, identifying the situation in the time it took to cross the threshold. Dren took in the 3 downed men, assessed each one, cataloged them as non-immediate. He took in Calum on one knee with a shoulder wound that was visibly fighting him. He took in Mara, standing between Calum and where the third man had been, with her left arm bleeding. He stopped taking inventory and looked at her arm. The wound was doing what it had been doing since the shot landed, the edges darkening in the specific way, and the slow, labored closing of tissue that should not have been closing on its own, not quickly, not completely, but visibly, undeniably, in a way that could not be attributed to anything in the category of ordinary human physiology. The service area was very quiet. Owen had appeared at the entrance to the alley, coming from the front of the diner, and he stood at the edge of the space and looked at the situation with the expression of someone who had arrived expecting one kind of scenario and found something they did not have a prepared response for. Ray said something in the old language, very low, a single phrase, not a question, an observation. Dren looked at Mara's arm for a moment that lasted long enough to be deliberate and not quite long enough to be extended. Then he looked at her face. She looked back. She had managed how people looked at her for 15 years. She had managed it in small situations and larger ones, had applied the specific performance of ordinary to every room and every gaze and every moment that required it, had become so practiced at the management that it had stopped feeling like management and had begun to feel simply like the surface of herself. She chose, standing in the orange light of the service area at 3 in the morning, with her arm bleeding, and the sealed room in her cracked open for the first time in 15 years, not to manage it. She simply let him look at what he was looking at. Dren's expression moved through several things in the space of a few seconds. She watched them move. She did not help them along, and did not resist them, and did not perform any response to them. She simply stood in the fact of herself. Mara. Calem's voice from the ground was rough at the edges. The silver was in his system, suppressing the healing, costing him the kind of sustained effort that a wound like this would otherwise not have required. But it was controlled. He had not lost his voice the way you lose things when you are in pain. He had the voice of a person whose control extended to their voice, as a matter of practice so deep it was structural. She looked at him. He said her name again. Not a command, not a question, a direction. I am looking at you. I am present. This is real, and I am in it with you. She said. I'm here. She crouched near him, not crowding the pack members who were beginning to organize around him, who had jobs to do, and were doing them, but near enough to be present. She looked at his shoulder. The silver was contained. The entry had been from sufficient distance that the round had not passed through, which meant the silver was still localized in the entry tissue, still active but not spreading outward. Arthur would need to come. She knew this. Dren was already saying it to Ray in a low, clipped way, and Ray was already moving. Owen came and stood near Mara. He had a first aid kit, which she thought was probably what he had run to get when she came around the corner, because Owen was the kind of young and capable person who ran toward the situation, rather than away from it, and whose first instinct in a crisis was to find out what was needed and supply it. He looked at her arm with the careful look of someone who did not know exactly what he was looking at, but understood that it was significant. He looked at her face. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that covered the situation appropriately, and he seemed to understand this instinctively. She held her arm out. He bandaged it with careful, steady hands. She watched him work and thought about the fact that she was letting him, that she was standing still and letting someone attend to her injury in the middle of a situation that would have sent the Mara Cole of an hour ago running for the Eastern Road and the interstate, and that this did not feel like resignation or defeat. It felt like the specific, unfamiliar sensation of not being alone in a situation that required managing. The suppression was cracked at its edges. She could feel this, not as a physical sensation, but as the absence of a quality that had been constant for 15 years, the total, seamless, undiscriminating concealment that her mother had built. It was no longer total. The exertion had fractured it. Through the fractures, very faintly, at the low volume of something that had been kept at low volume for so long it had forgotten it could be louder. The thing that had always been there was leaking into the air around her. Calem was breathing carefully, not the breath of someone simply managing pain, the deliberate, specific inhalation of someone reading something in the air that required precision to read. She watched his face while he breathed. She watched him find it. It was not a dramatic thing, the way she had always half imagined it would be, when she had allowed herself to imagine it at all, in the late nights in various rooms in various towns, when the imagination had slipped past her management. It was not the dramatic moment of revelation that stories made out of moments like this. It was a breath, a change in the specific quality of his stillness, a very small recalibration of something behind his eyes, the movement of a person whose framework for understanding a thing has just encountered information that does not fit the framework, and who is in the half-second before the framework adjusts. He did not react. He did not speak. He simply underwent, very precisely and without advertisement, the experience of understanding something differently than he had understood it moments before. He looked at her. She was still crouching near him, close enough that she was within the radius of what he was breathing. She was looking back at him with the face she had not been performing. Just her face. Just the one that existed before she had learned to manage what was on it. Just what was actually there. Dren had gone very still behind her. Owen, who was still holding the bandaging, stopped moving. The pack, which had been organizing itself efficiently around the situation, had become very quiet in the specific way of a group of people receiving information that is not spoken aloud and that requires a moment to process. She let them process it. She was done managing this. She had been managing one version or another of this for 15 years, and she was done with it, and the specific quality of being done with something, of having made the decision at the deepest available level, and finding that the decision held, was something she had not expected to feel this way, which was not like relief, but was adjacent to it, like setting down something heavy enough that you had stopped noticing it was heavy. Arthur arrived, compact and focused, carrying the bag she had recognized as a medical kit before she saw it. He moved to Calum with the direct efficiency of someone whose expertise was complete, and whose job right now was to apply it. Calum allowed this with the controlled grace of a person who understood the difference between accepting help and surrendering, who had made that distinction long ago and was at peace with it. Mara stood up. Owen stepped back slightly to give her room. She looked at the three men on the ground, conscious, injured at varying degrees, none in serious danger, all of them removed from the situation for the foreseeable future. She looked at the service area, the orange light, the fence with the bullet hole in it, the three positions where the men had been standing when she came around the corner. She thought, I came around the corner. She had come around the corner, in the middle of the night, in a situation she had identified and not reported, and not left, and she had placed herself between a weapon and the person behind her, and her arm had paid the price of it, and the price of it had broken the seal, and the seal breaking had let out the thing that had been sealed, and now every wolf in this service area knew something that she had spent 15 years making sure no wolf could know. She thought about all of this with the specific, exhausted clarity of someone who has been moving very fast and has just stopped. She thought, all right, it was done. Whatever came next came from here, from this specific point of having been seen, and what came next was not something she could manage in advance. She could only be present in it. She looked at Calum, who was being attended to by Arthur, and was looking at her over Arthur's shoulder. His expression was the expression of a man recalibrating, thoroughly and without haste, everything he had thought he understood about the last several weeks. She met his eyes. She did not look away. The safe house was a stone building at the east edge of Ashvale, old and thick-walled and warm inside, with the specific warmth of a place that had been consistently occupied and cared for, rather than simply heated. The walls were 2 feet thick. The windows were small and deep-set in the stone. The floors were wood, old enough to have the particular solidity of timber that had finished settling decades ago, and was no longer capable of surprising anyone with its sounds. They brought Calum there, while Arthur worked on his shoulder in the adjacent room. Mara was given the main room, a wooden chair near the table, and the specific status of someone whose situation had not yet been formally addressed. Not a prisoner, not exactly a guest, something in the space between those categories that did not have a clean name. She sat in the wooden chair and kept her rebandaged arm in her lap and looked at the grain of the table and listened to the sounds from the next room. Arthur's low, precise instructions to the person assisting him, the sounds of medical work being done carefully and correctly, the controlled breathing of a person managing pain without making an announcement of it. The main room was busy for the first 30 minutes, pack members moving in and out, delivering reports, receiving instruction. Owen came through twice, Ray once. Dren sat at the far end of the table and worked his phone with the absorbed, multi-tracked focus of someone running several simultaneous lines of inquiry and managing to keep them separate. None of them spoke to Mara directly, which she understood as neither hostility nor oversight, but as the reasonable organization of priorities. The immediate situation first, the larger questions when there was time to address them properly. She sat and waited and looked at the table. Arthur came through from the other room after 30 minutes and checked her arm without preamble. He removed Owen's bandaging and inspected the wound with the focused attention of someone whose professional vision went deeper than surface appearance. He did not comment on the way the wound's edges had partially closed, on the specific texture of the healing that was happening in the silver-touch tissue, on any of the things that were visible to him and that he clearly understood the implications of. He rebandaged it more precisely than Owen had managed and said, in the level, practical tone of someone reporting a clinical finding, "Keep that still for a few hours," she said. "All right." He nodded once and left through the back. Calum came through shortly after. He moved with the controlled economy of a person carrying a newly dressed shoulder wound who had decided that the wound's preferences regarding his movement were not relevant. He came to the table and sat at the head of it, and he looked at Dren. Dren held his gaze for a moment, and then set his phone face down on the table. The sounds of the building settling, the wind outside, the low hiss of the heating. Calum said, "Clear the building." Not loudly. Not as a command that needed volume to be a command. Sounds of people moving through doors. Then silence. The three of them sat in the silence for a moment. Calum, at the head of the table. Dren at the far end. Mara, at the side between them. Calum looked at her. She met his eyes. He said, "Your name isn't Cole." She said, "No." He waited. He was very good at waiting. Not the tense waiting of someone suppressing the urge to push for what they wanted. He did not appear to be suppressing anything. He had the patient quality of someone who understood that certain information arrived at its own time, and that trying to accelerate it generally produced worse information, and who had therefore made his peace with waiting as a tool. She looked at the table for a moment. She looked at the grain of the old wood, the parallel lines running from one end to the other, unchanged, and patient, and entirely indifferent to the things happening in the room above them. She looked at this for a moment, and then she looked back at him. "Voss," she said. "Mara Voss." Dren opened his phone. The sound of a search being initiated. She watched him do it without comment. She said, "You won't find anything. My mother was very thorough." Dren looked up briefly, the specific look of a person noting new information that adjusts the parameters of what they are doing, and then looked back at the screen. She said, "My father's name was Glenn Voss. He was a rogue alpha. He lived outside any territory, outside any pack arrangement, for his entire adult life." She said it plainly, because that was the tone it came out in when she did not try to manage the delivery. The weight was already in the information itself. She did not need to add to it with presentation. "He was not a violent man," she continued. "He was not in conflict with anyone. He had never initiated a confrontation with any pack or any territory. He was simply independent. He believed that a wolf's first loyalty was to themselves and their family, rather than to a territory's authority, and he lived by that belief openly. There were packs that considered this position a problem, not because of anything he did, but because of what his existence demonstrated. He proved that the choice was a choice. For packs that had built their authority on the premise that submission was inevitable rather than chosen, a man who chose otherwise was a problem that needed to be addressed eventually. She paused. "He was killed when I was 12 years old. 3 enforcers came at dawn. My mother had known they were coming. She had sources. She had prepared for this for years, while hoping she would never need the preparation. The night before they arrived, she performed a suppression ritual on me. It was permanent and irreversible. It hid what I was behind a presentation that read as human. She put me on a bus the next morning, with false documents, and enough cash to start somewhere else, and a letter that told me to find my way back to myself when it was time." The room held the silence. Calum had not moved during any of this. His hands were on the table, one on each side of the coffee mug Arthur had left for him. He was looking at her with the same quality of full, complete attention that she had grown accustomed to across a counter in the weeks before tonight. Not analytical or interrogative, just present, just fully receiving what was being said. Dren said, "Glenn Voss." He lowered his phone. "That name appears in an incomplete inquiry from several years ago, a review of circumstances surrounding the deaths of several rogue alphas during a period of territory consolidation in the northern regions. The inquiry was closed without conclusion." Mara said, "I didn't know there had been an inquiry." Dren said, "It was conducted quietly. It did not produce results." A pause. Then he said, "What happened to your mother?" She said, "I don't know. We had no contact after the bus. She was clear that contact would be a risk neither of us could afford." The truth of this sat in the room, and she did not try to make it smaller or more manageable. It was what it was, and it had been what it was for 15 years, and she had learned not to try to make true things easier than they were, because the effort of doing so was another thing that cost you something, without giving you anything back. Caleb said, "The faction that sent the 3 men tonight." She looked at him. He said, "They have been operating across at least 9 territories for the past 18 months, possibly longer. Their stated purpose is governance reform, the consolidation and rationalization of pack authority, the elimination of what they describe as structural vulnerabilities in the existing arrangements. In practice, this has meant the systematic targeting and removal of wolves who exist outside the established pack hierarchy. Rogues, independents, anyone whose bloodline could not be accounted for within a territory's records and authority structure." He said this with the flat, informational quality of someone conveying something accurate and bad, and not attempting to cushion it. She felt the cold of it settle into her chest. He said, "They have been using the territorial dispute in this region as operational cover. Prolonging the conflict between the 2 packs gave them a reason to maintain a presence and an operation in the area, without the presence attracting the specific scrutiny it would have otherwise attracted. The ceasefire I negotiated threatened their cover, which is why they moved when they did." She said, "They were not only after you." He said, "No. Removing me was the primary objective. It would have restarted the conflict and removed the primary authority working against their operation here. But they were running a secondary operation alongside it." He paused. "Their intelligence indicated that there was an individual of rogue bloodline in Ashvale. Not confirmed, but they were in the process of confirming it." She sat with this. She understood then the full shape of what 15 years had been. Not only the grief of losing her father and the caution of someone who had watched him be killed and understood what that meant for her. Not only the ordinary survivor's arithmetic of risk and safety and movement and concealment. Something larger than that, with a longer reach. She had been hiding from people who had been actively looking, not specifically for her, not necessarily, but for anything with the kind of bloodline she carried, in the kind of existence she maintained, outside the categories they were systematically closing down. Her mother had known this at 12 years old, had performed the ritual not only to protect Mara from the immediate danger of the people coming for Glenn, but from the longer danger of the kind of people who kept coming. The exhaustion of understanding this fully was very large. She sat with it. She let it be large. She did not try to reduce it. Then she said, "How long has this faction been active?" Caleb said, "The earliest confirmed operation was 7 years ago." She said, "My mother performed the ritual 12 years ago." He said, "I know." She looked at him. She said, "She knew they were already coming. Not yet specifically for her, but coming for anything like us." He said nothing. He did not need to say anything. She looked at the table again, the grain of the old wood, patient and unchanged. She breathed in, slowly, and let the full weight of understanding settle into her, without trying to distribute it somewhere more manageable, because there was nowhere more manageable to put it. It was hers. It had been hers all along. She was simply, finally, accepting the full terms of it. After a long moment, Caleb said, "You knew something was coming. You told me as much, the last time we spoke." She said, "I said I thought something was coming. I didn't say what I planned to do about it." He said, "You had time to leave. You are very effective at leaving." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why didn't you?" She thought about how to answer this honestly. She thought about 15 years and 11 towns, and the packed bag, and the letter, and her mother kneeling in front of her at 12 years old, telling her that being hidden was not the same as being erased. She thought about the sealed room, and what she had found when she reached for it, and what it had felt like to find it still there, still waiting, patient, the way old things are patient. She said, "Because sometimes protecting yourself stops being enough." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "What does that mean for what comes next?" She said, "I don't know yet. Ask me again when I've slept." Something moved in his expression. Brief, small, the compressed fraction of an expression that on another face would have been something more openly felt. She watched it move, and did not look away from it, and let herself see it fully. It was, she thought, the beginning of something that did not yet have a name, in the way that beginnings often did not have names, until after they had continued long enough to be recognizable as what they were. She was tired, and her arm ached with the specific deep complaint of silver in the tissue, and the night had been the most significant night of her life, in at least 15 years, and she was still here, and she was Mara Voss, and those were the two facts she had to hold on to right now, and they were sufficient. They were more than sufficient. They were enough. 3 weeks later, the name Mara Cole was gone. Not discarded, not ceremonially retired, not announced to anyone as a thing that was happening. Simply gone, in the quiet way that things go when you stop needing them, when the function they served has been completed, and the need they addressed has changed its fundamental shape. She did not file anything. She did not explain it to anyone who had not been in that service area at 3 in the morning 3 weeks before. She simply stopped using it, and the using of it stopped, and one morning she woke up in the room above the hardware store, and she was Mara Voss, and that was what she was, and there was nothing more to say about it. The town of Ashevale absorbed this transition without visible reaction, which was partly because the town had never known either name with deep investment, and partly because the weeks following the night in the service area had been eventful in ways that made one woman's name the least interesting piece of news available. Arthur worked with her across 3 sessions in the first week following the alley. He was a compact, deliberate man who treated his work with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that precision here was not perfectionism, but responsibility. In the first session, he simply assessed what was there, the fractures in the ritual's outer surface, the way the suppression had held completely in some places and cracked at the edges in others, the specific geography of what 15 years of sustained exertion had built and what one night of extreme exertion had done to it. He was quiet during the assessment. She had appreciated this. The second and third sessions were different. He had found something she had not expected to find possible, not a repair of the suppression, not a restoration of the seamless concealment that had been there before. Vera had been right that the ritual was irreversible, and Arthur confirmed this without apology or softening, because he was not the kind of person who softened accurate information, but a way to work with what the fractures had created. The cracked edges of the ritual had changed the nature of the suppression from something absolute and external to something that could, with attention and practice, be directed. The control was hers. She could raise the suppression to something close to what it had been before. She could lower it, or lower parts of it. She could choose, consciously and specifically, what she made available to the people around her, and what she kept to herself. This was not, she understood, a simple gift. The practice required was real, and the attention it demanded was sustained, and there would be moments, under stress, under extreme exertion, in situations like the alley, when the direction would slip, and the suppression would do what it had always done, respond to the state of her body, rather than the intention of her mind. She would need to work on this. Arthur had told her this plainly, and she had received it plainly, and they had shaken hands at the end of the third session, in the specific, mutual way of two people who have completed a task together and respect each other for having done it competently. The control, imperfect and requiring ongoing work, was hers. The difference between a lock that opened from the outside and a key, the difference between a concealment imposed on her and a choice she made, was not something she tried to explain to anyone, because it was not something that could be adequately explained to anyone who had not spent 15 years on the wrong side of it. She simply lived in it, day by day, as the weeks passed and it became less something she was aware of, and more something that was simply how things were. The faction's leadership was dismantled in the second and third weeks. The 3 men from the service area provided information through a process she did not observe directly and did not ask for detailed accounts of. What she knew was the outcome: names, locations, connections. Dren followed the threads with the methodical, unsentimental dedication she had come to understand was his particular mode of excellence. 2 of the faction's senior operatives were apprehended in separate locations 4 days apart. A third fled the region and was tracked to a location outside Calem's immediate jurisdiction, where the tracking was handed to people with the standing to act on it. The political fallout was significant and ongoing. 3 established packs had relationships of varying degrees with the faction's operations. Some of them had known the full shape of what the faction was doing. Some had known parts of it. Some had simply accepted resources from the faction without examining the source too carefully. Untangling these relationships and determining what each pack's leadership had understood and when they had understood it was the kind of sustained diplomatic and investigative work that could not be rushed without producing results that would not hold, and Calum did not rush it. He remained in Ashvale longer than his original timeline had apparently planned for. She did not examine this too closely. She stopped working at the diner in the first week. She had things to manage that made the morning shifts impractical for a period, and then started again in the beginning of the third week. Lena had received her return the way she received most things, with the warm, unsurprised practicality of a woman who had been running a small business for 30 years and had learned that the people in her life moved through phases, and that the wisest thing was to leave the door open and not make anyone feel that returning required an explanation. Lena had handed her an apron and said, "The early rush is harder without you," and Mara had put on the apron, and that had been all there was to say. She walked the town in the mornings now, before her shift began. This was new. Not the walking. She had always been a person who walked, who used motion as a way of thinking, who found that the body in movement helped the mind process what the body at rest could not fully reach. What was new was the quality of the walking. She was not planning exits. She was not mapping coverage gaps or noting positions or calculating response times. She was not, at the deepest level of what she was doing, walking through Ashvale in the mode of someone managing their presence in a space. She was simply walking. In the cold morning light, along the cracked Main Street pavement and the side roads that ran between buildings and then opened at the edges of town into the beginning of the forest, she walked, because she was in Ashvale, and it was morning, and she chose to be in it rather than moving through it. This distinction was not small. Owen nodded at her from across Main Street one morning as she was coming back from the eastern side of town, and she nodded back, and that was a whole conversation, and it was sufficient. Ray, who she had never heard address her directly, and whom she did not particularly expect to, made a brief upward motion of his chin one afternoon outside the diner that she received as acknowledgement and returned in kind. These were not large things. She did not require them to be large things. They were the ordinary texture of being present somewhere, of being a person who occupied a space and was known, even slightly, to the other people who occupied it, and that was enough. Dren was careful around her. This was fair, and she did not take it personally, and she thought he would work his way through his particular version of the recalibration in the time it took him, which would be the right amount of time. He was a thorough person. Thorough people did not rush recalibrations. She could respect this without needing it to move faster than it was moving. On a morning in the beginning of the fourth week, she arrived at the diner before Lena and started the coffee herself, with the key she had been given in the first week of the job, and had never returned when she stepped back from the shifts, because Lena had not asked for it, and she had not offered it, and perhaps both of them had understood something in that mutual omission that neither had needed to put into words. She had the counter set and the first pot ready by the time Lena came through the back. The morning rush came and went with the specific pleasant noise of it. Orders called through the kitchen window, the bell above the door ringing at intervals, the particular energy of a room full of people in the early part of their day, who have not yet encountered whatever the day has for them, and are still carrying the temporary ease of morning. She moved through it with the efficiency she had always brought, the efficiency that was not performance anymore, had not been performance for weeks now, was simply the way she operated in this space, because the space had become somewhere she actually was, rather than somewhere she was temporarily inhabiting while preparing to be somewhere else. At 10:15, the bell above the door rang. She was at the far end of the counter, doing what she was often doing at the far end of the counter, and she did not look up immediately. Not from the practiced habit of appearing occupied. She had stopped doing things for that reason, had stopped managing her behavior from the outside in, had stopped performing the ordinary, and started simply being in it. She did not look up because she was finishing what she was doing, and when she was done she looked up. He sat at the same stool. He always sat at the same stool. She had watched him choose it every time, in the specific way you watch someone make a choice, that they make consistently enough that it has the appearance of not being a choice at all, but is always, on examination, a choice. The stool with the good sight lines, the one from which both the entrance and the window onto Main Street were visible, the one that placed him with his back, not entirely to any wall. She had watched him choose it, and she understood the choice, and she did not find it remarkable, because she had her own version of it, and she had simply stopped pretending she did not. He did not speak. She poured his coffee. She did not ask if he wanted it because she knew he wanted it. She had known he wanted it the first time he came in, and ordered it, and every time since, and she had been pouring it without asking for long enough that they both understood the asking was unnecessary. He wrapped his hands around the cup. He looked at the surface of the coffee for a moment, in the way he sometimes looked at things when he was letting himself be present in a space rather than operating in it. Then he looked up. He said, "How are you?" She heard the specific quality of the question, not "How is your arm?" though her arm continued to have opinions about itself that she was gradually learning to manage alongside everything else Arthur had given her to work with. Not "What are your plans?" which was a question he had asked her in the second week, and which she had answered honestly. She did not know yet. Just the plain, complete question, that was not a social form, but an actual inquiry, asked by a person who genuinely wanted to know the answer, and was prepared to receive whatever the answer was. She thought about it. She gave it the time it deserved, which was a habit she had been developing. The unfamiliar luxury of pausing before she spoke, not because she was managing what she said, but because she was thinking about what was actually true, and trying to say it. She said, "I don't know yet, but I think that's probably all right." He nodded, one of his small, precise nods that said, "Received, understood, accepted." He drank his coffee. She stood at the counter and looked through the window, and Ashvale was doing what Ashvale did on a morning in the 4th week of her 3rd month there. A woman walked a brown dog along the far side of Main Street, the dog pulling slightly toward the alley between the pharmacy and the hardware store, and the woman redirecting it without breaking stride. The delivery truck made its slow, familiar way toward the grocery store, the driver visible through the windshield with his elbow on the door, and the particular ease of a man who had made this route enough times to have stopped thinking about it. 2 people stood outside the pharmacy in conversation, their breath making brief, visible clouds in the cold air. The sky had moved from the flat gray of very early morning to the pale and spreading gold that mountain towns got on clear winter days, as if the light had found an angle it liked and was making the most of it before it shifted. She watched all of it. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the herb bundles drying from the ceiling beams. She thought about the bus station and the letter and the instruction to find her way back to herself when it was time. She thought about 11 towns and the bag under the bed and the lamp she had always left on in every room she rented, and how she had done that not for anyone else, but so that coming back to a lit window would feel, even briefly, like coming back to something that was hers. She thought about the alley and standing between the weapon and the person behind her, and the specific quality of that moment, not heroic, not the version that stories make out of such things, just the clear and physical fact of having made a decision before the moment arrived, and finding, when the moment arrived, that the decision held. She thought about what it meant to have made a decision that held. The bag was still under the bed in the room above the hardware store. She had not touched it in 3 weeks, had not checked it, or verified its contents, or thought about what she would need if she needed to leave quickly. It was simply there, the way things are there when they no longer need to be ready, when their particular function has been quietly made unnecessary by the accumulation of days in which the function did not need to be exercised. She was not going to leave. She was not making this decision in the formal, examined way of decisions made with full consciousness of all their implications. She was noting it as a fact about herself, the way you note facts about yourself that have been true for a while, and that you are only now getting around to officially acknowledging. She was in Ashvale. She was Mara Voss. She was not hiding. These were not an ending. She understood this clearly. The faction had been disrupted, but the world that had produced the faction had not changed its fundamental shape. Dren was adjusting, but had not fully adjusted. The question of what she was in relation to the pack around her, and what the pack was in relation to her, and whether any of that required a name or a formal arrangement, or whether it could simply be what it was open, and would take time that she was not in a hurry to compress. Arthur had given her tools to use, but the using of them was practice, and practice took time. Calum had not asked her to join the pack. She had known he would not. She had also known, in the early hours after the safe house conversation, that if he had, she would not have agreed, and she had understood without needing it spoken, that he knew this too, that they had been sitting across from each other at a counter for weeks, paying attention, and that certain things become understood between people who are genuinely paying attention to each other without requiring a conversation in order to be understood. What he had offered instead was not a formal thing. It was harder to name than a formal thing, which she suspected was partly why it suited her. It was acknowledgement. It was presence. It was the specific kind of respect that did not require her to belong to anything or anyone as a precondition, that asked her to be exactly what she was and offered itself in return. She was still learning how to receive that. She was learning, in general, more things than she had expected to need to learn in the 4th week of her 3rd month in a small mountain town, at the end of a 15-year construction that was no longer the shape of her life. This was inconvenient and also the thing that made her certain she was in the right place, because things that required no learning were things you had already completed, and completion was a kind of leaving, and she was done leaving for a while. She turned from the window and refilled her own coffee from the pot on the warmer. She set the pot down. She stood at the counter with her cup. Caleb was looking at something outside the window, one hand still around his mug, the particular quality of his stillness present and familiar, and slightly, subtly different from what it had been 3 weeks ago. The difference was small enough that she might not have noticed it if she had not been paying the specific kind of attention she paid to things she was still in the process of understanding. The readiness was still there. It was structural in him. She did not think it would ever not be there. But the compression in it was looser, as if something had been set down, not entirely, but partially, as if he was carrying the same weight in a slightly different way, and the slight difference mattered. She thought, he is also in the process of something. She thought, good, that seems about right. She picked up the coffee pot and went to take care of the 2 new customers who had just come through the door, because the morning was moving, and there was work to do. And the work was here, and she was here, and those 2 facts fit together, the way things fit together when they are in the right place. The bell above the door rang behind the new customers, clear and ordinary in the warm morning air of the diner. Outside the window, Ashevale was doing its morning things in the pale gold light. She was Mara Voss. She was here. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything.